Welcome to SmallTalk by Sfarim Chatter. I'm Nachi Weinstein. This episode of SmallTalk, I'm going to be joined once again by Sina Kahen and also by Ben Rolstein, and we'll be discussing the book titled Vayiqra in Context, a scientific and Kabbalistic commentary of Leviticus by Rabbi Elia Benamozegh, which is an English adaptation of Rabbi Elia Benamozegh's Aim LaMikra on Vayiqra. There actually is a new edition published of that by Machon Arvi Yeshua, but this is an adaptation into English of a fascinating commentary with a full story in and of itself. I should mention that this Vayiqra in Context was published by Dot Press. The Aim LaMikra of Leo Benamozegh is a controversial work, to say the least, and Rabbi Benamozegh wrote a defense, which was published by Dot Press and will be the subject of a forthcoming Sfarim Chatter episode. But for this episode and the Aim LaMikra adaptation, thank you, Sina and Ben, for joining me.
Thank you.
Let's start off. Sina, what can you tell the listeners about this book?
So, Aim LaMikra, it's one for the history books. You have this Hacham called Elia Benamozegh. He's a 19th century Italian, Moroccan rabbi, philosopher, Kabbalist, a public intellectual, and he's based in Livorno, where he also is a Dayan. And he was raised amidst a fusion, if you like, between Sephardi traditions and European modernity. Remember, in the 1820s, that's a period where you've got the modernity really kicking in. And he really was mastering not only Hebrew texts, but classical philosophy, natural science, world literature, and was able to communicate or study these things in Italian, French, Spanish, Arabic, Hebrew. And he came up with this magnum opus of his, Aim LaMikra, which is a sweeping commentary on the Torah. And it blends all of those topics that I've talked about, whether it's Talmudic insight, Kabbalistic depth, scientific and philosophical rigor. And we've called it the Moreh HaNebuchim of Torah commentary, because he wasn't only challenging biblical criticism and scientific skepticism, but he was reasserting the enduring truth that he felt he could show between God's word, being the Torah, and God's world. And it was a little bit controversial for the time. When it came out, some of the rabbis in Aleppo and in Damascus, in modern-day Syria, weren't too fond of the integration of secular sources in Torah interpretation. So they put the book in Cherem. Some apparently burnt it, but he was defended by other communities, notably Kaf HaChaim, big authority at the time, defended him, and other Sephardi communities in Greece and Turkey under the Ottoman Empire as well. So it's a controversial book. But as I say, it's the Moreh HaNebuchim of Torah commentary.
Also defended him, and there's the letter to the rabbis of Yerushalayim, Jerusalem. That's for the full controversy will be subject of another episode, a full-length episode. So with this work, it is fascinating because he is a Kabbalist and he defends authenticity of the Zohar. For example, he has multiple books on that. He quotes a lot of Kabbalah in here, but he also is bringing non-Jewish sources, historical, archaeological evidence. It's a fascinating work. I'm also curious how some of that holds up today. He wrote this a while ago, 150 years ago.
So really, you usually look at the history of Jewish hashkafa, if you like, and you've got these two schools of thought. Those who interpret Maaseh Merkabah as being science and philosophy, and those who interpret Maaseh Merkabah being Kabbalah, as expressed by the Zohar. Which type of Kabbalah, that's another debate. But essentially, these two schools of thought have been at odds with each other. The Maimonidean controversies, etc., etc., etc. Hacham Benamozegh is very unique in his ability to straddle both worlds. In a way, even though I, and I'm sure Ben, hold more of the scientific philosophical tradition, but he does it in such a way, integrating these two worlds so succinctly and clearly that it's a science in and of itself. And I don't think I know of any Hacham that could claim to be of these both traditions and uphold it so well. I mean, as you say, he genuinely held the Zohar or Kabbalah being part of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Now, those, if you think of the Dardaim and those really on that scientific philosophical sort of thought, would be completely opposed to this. But he was able to, as we'll see in one of the examples, bring sources from both worldviews in a very beautiful and coherent way. And I really think he's the model for the future of Judaism in being able to integrate these two developed schools of thoughts through
Ben,
Galut
let me
until now.
turn it over to you. What was the process of writing or adapting this book? Because this is not a verse by verse translation; it's more an adaptation. So, what was that like?
Sina started writing this work, if I'm not mistaken, because he wanted some contextual understanding of Vayiqra, which can seem quite esoteric. The Hebrew is not easy. It's not easy. It's also, you have to be fluent in quite a few languages, because he'll just do direct quotes from French, Italian, and as some of the languages Sina was speaking about earlier. It's not so helpful to really put this into a translation. It would be quite a scholarly thing. You'd need quite extensive footnotes, and that is an undertaking for which we did not have necessarily the time or the resources, or, to be honest, the market, for something it would be quite difficult to access. So the purpose of writing a summary, or not a summary because it details everything he said, but writing an English kind of interpretation of it, or an English restatement of what he's written, as opposed to a direct translation, makes it a lot more accessible for people to read, and makes it it's much easier to kind of glean the lessons that he's trying to teach in Em Mikra, when you've got it in a kind of English rewrite as opposed to a direct Hebrew translation.
What he did, the one thing I have to mention about Ben, so I went away initially having studied Em Mikra, because I had written on Bereshit and Shemot, but I was stuck on my Vayiqra edition because it was such a difficult book to understand. I went and studied Em Mikra, and then when I was putting down together, the notes, that I said, okay, I'm going to convert these into mini essays, or summaries or adaptations of the commentary. When I was done with this, I sent it to none other than my dear friend and scholarly friend of mine, Ben. And I asked him, look, have a look. Let me know what you think. He came back with so many comments and edits and recommendations that, for all intents and purposes, it was not publishable in the way that I wanted. My version was not publishable. So I asked him, listen, I want to action all of these because this is fantastic. So he kindly agreed to be the co-author, and he gave it the shape that it required to be published. So it's big thanks to Ben. So thank you, Ben, if I can say it publicly.
You're welcome. Many an hour was spent tracking down obscure references in kind of shorthand that he's written from some Italian journal that came out in the mid-19th century.
When you guys were doing this, was Rabbi Zaini's new edition out? Because his new edition, he has extensive footnotes. Or did you do this before he published his edition?
It was available, but we didn't use it.
I think it was available. Been published. I think it literally had just been published. So I had Em Mikra on Hebrew books, and then also the Sefaria, because there were additional bits that he put in a second time, where he re-released it with extra parts that are not on the Hebrew book scan but are on the Sefaria. And then you have to also hope that the OCR, when they do the text recognition, has done it faithfully. I submitted a couple of corrections to Sefaria where the OCR hadn't done it correctly, in my opinion.
Ben, let me ask you, what can you say about Benamozegh style in Em Mikra generally, and then specifically as it pertains to Vayiqra?
So something that it put me in mind of when I was reading the commentary, and that actually this thought was shared by my wife's grandfather, who read over the book as well, was that it actually reminded us of the Hertz Chumash. And I think that's quite a modern, you can use that to have a grasp of like a more modern work that is actually quite a similar style to Em Mikra, in the sense that Benamozegh's style, as Sina mentioned, is you've got two kind of world views that he's trying to marry together. And it comes back to his philosophy of the world, and it's essentially the sense that he views all of the world and all the world's cultures of having a kind of Kabbalistic divine root that they go back to. And so you can look at Greek mythology, as he does. He has a crazy thing about Athena and associating it with Kabbalistic Sephirot in one of the comments. But, you go back to Greek mythology, you can go back to Egyptian mythology, and somewhere he sees this core of truth, divine truth, and Kabbalah, which, he has this expression he uses, bearing the seal or the stamp of diviner truth, rather. So he sees everything as interconnected in that sense. And when you do that, he kind of marshals everything to support the Torah. And that did put me in mind of the Hertz Chumash, in the sense that part of what Benamozegh's crusade, if I can borrow the term, is that he wants to demonstrate the authenticity of the Torah. He wants to demonstrate that it's true against the rising academic tide against the Torah's authenticity. And he will take whatever support he finds in the most modern academic studies of the time to do so. Even if we say some of it may be, discredited or out of favor, especially some of the linguistic stuff now, it doesn't matter, so to speak, from his perspective, in the same way that kind of Hertz was using academia of the time to establish the veracity of Torah. So he does a similar thing with the academia of his time to, again, defend the Torah. A very short example that springs to mind now is he has a point about mermaids. And he says, Chazal basically in the Sifra, they cite that there was something about a mermaid. And then he's like, people, you can imagine it, because you imagine a skeptic now, a Chazal skeptic who says, clearly they didn't know what they were talking about. They believed in all these crazy ideas. And he's like, well, actually, Pliny documents it in his his natural creatures. He lists the mermaid as one of the things that is reported as a real living being. And it's like, yes, well, Chazal had the science of their time as well. And so if you're going to attack their institution, the institution of Chazal based on their science, you've got to do the same for the Greco-Roman science that was current at the time. I really like that style that he has. It's very much his general approach across all of Emla Mikra. Sorry, I haven't addressed the part of your question you asked about Vayiqra specifically. I don't know if Sina wants to take that.
I think Vayiqra really is the best springboard for him to present his holistic understanding of the world, because Vayiqra, for all intents and purposes, requires a pretty deep understanding of ancient Near Eastern history and all the different mythologies that exist in the world, archaeology, with all of the sacrifices and the paraphernalia surrounding it. So he'll explain, okay, why is the right ear where the blood is placed upon? And then he'll contextualize it with an ancient Near Eastern practice. He'll say, why is honey forbidden to be provided with the korbanot? And he'll explain, because honey was something the pre-Torah societies would provide with their korbanot, because this would sweeten the taste to the deities. And Vayiqra, given how it's so full of these lack of a better term, strange terms and concepts, it really provided Hacham Benamozegh with the opportunity to clarify them using the worldly knowledge. And it just kept bringing me back to what Harambam says in Moreh HaNebuchim, where he says that, I've been reading the books of the Sabians, the pre-Torah society, and I wish we had access to more. If we had access to more chronicles of the history and things that were going on before the Torah, it would make clear a lot of the strange terms and mitzvot that we have in the Torah. So that's what Emla Mikra, especially the Vayiqra edition, provides. It's what Harambam would have dreamed of, having access to all of these realms of worldly knowledge to unpack some of the pesukim that seem strange, lack of a better term, upon visceral
What examples of
viewing.
that can you give?
My favorite example. You've got the pasuk, Lo tochelu al hadam, lo tenacheshu ve'lo ta'onenu. So don't eat over the blood. Don't practice nichush, which is divination, and don't practice onen, which is augury. Now, when we first look at this pasuk, it seems like a list of disconnected prohibitions. But Benamozegh beautifully connects the dots. He explains that this concept of eating over the blood, lo tochelu al hadam, it refers to a widespread idolatrous practice. So there were ancient cults. They would gather on mountaintops, they would dig pits, slaughter the animals, and they would then pour that blood into the pit as part of a necromantic ritual. And this would be a way to summon the dead to gain insight or favors. Now, he ties this to classical sources like the Septuagint, but also he renders the verse, don't eat over the mountains, and to Yecheskel, where Yecheskel, it's written, righteous individuals are praised for not eating upon the mountains. In other words, meaning avoiding these idolatrous rituals. Then he looks at Talmudic insights. Goes to Sanhedrin 81a, and he shows that Chazal interprets this eating on mountains metaphorically, which means not relying on the merit of one's ancestors for spiritual favor, but standing on one's own righteousness. So he shows how both the literal and metaphorical interpretations enrich our understanding of the pasuk. And then this is where it's really classic Benamozegh. He goes cross-cultural, and he brings in examples from Homer's Odyssey, where Ulysses performs a similar blood ritual to summon the dead. Then he goes to Roman satire, where he shows Lucian in the Roman satire describing magical pit rituals. He then references 18th century scholar Pluche, I don't know how you pronounce it, medical writers like Ludovic Nunes, showing how divination and augury, in the Latin it's auspicio et augurio, were historically rooted in observing birds. And this is exactly how the Talmud describes Nichush and Onen, using weasels and birds. He then goes into the Arabic, and he shows that if we look for the word for omen in Arabic, it's ta'ir. Now, ta'ir literally means bird. And he notes that the Zohar discusses Jewish involvement in such practices, and then ultimately agrees that they're forbidden. So this is vintage Benamozegh, this example. A verse that is so easy to overlook suddenly becomes a doorway into ancient history, into rabbinic wisdom, classical literature, linguistic archaeology. And it really shows that this model of studying the Torah, understanding the Pesukim in its broader context, it brings it to life in a way that is really unparalleled.
Ben, you have any examples that you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I love Sina's one. I knew he was going to choose that one, but there's a couple of really interesting things. The one that I want to focus on that really just maybe think about why this is really characteristic of Benamozegh. He talks about the Azazel, what exactly? Not even translatable. I was going to try and translate the Azazel goat that is sent to Azazel, and he goes through a couple of questions about the meaning of the word, the etymology, where it could have come from, and he discusses it, and he argues on Shaddal, and he argues on Naftali Wesley and various different people. But what I thought was so interesting was his linking of it to Egyptian mythology, and then also the New Testament. I just thought it's so characteristic of his approach. So again, he's very much convinced, as being of a Kabbalistic bent, he is very much convinced that the name Azazel is in reference to some kind of evil demon, some kind of evil power. He's very much convinced of that. But he links it to Egypt, where he talks about a star that's called Ra'ah. And when it says that Ra'ah neged penechem, that the evil is in front of you, he links this to the star of Ra'ah, and he also links it to the Egyptian, Typhon in Greek, but in Egyptian that was Set, the god Set. And he links it to Set and the power that, who was associated with the desert, where of course the Azazel is sent. And then he reinterprets the pasuk, Lama Yomru Mitzrayim Limor Bara'ah Hotziam, that God brought them out Bara'ah, like we've always, translated it in, for evil purposes, because he was going to kill them, after the golden calf. But Benamozegh is changing that interpretation. He's saying Bara'ah as Ra'ah, meaning the god Set, who dwells in the desert, he took them out. Which I thought was fascinating. I mean, it's a whole long, it's spread over two different comments that he has, where he talks about the Azazel and then sending it into the desert. It's spread across two different comments. But then he has a whole thing about the desert and the connection, not only to Set, the god of the desert, but also to Matthew 4, where it's the temptation of Jesus, where he's led into the desert and tempted by the devil, Ho Diabolos, or in one source, the other one it's Ho Piazzon, I think, the tempter, the one who gives temptation. And Benamozegh says, this happens in the desert because that's where exorcised demons and spirits go. And I'm kind of reading this thinking, I definitely don't agree with him here, but this is such a fascinating direction to take this in. And it's so thought-provoking, the way he's willing to link the Azazel to Egyptian mythology and to the New Testament. I just found it so paradigmatic and characteristic of his approach.
Those examples really sum up the work, and I think the listeners can get kind of a feel of what it is. Okay, so what was this translation adaptation process like?
Go ahead, Ben.
I feel like I spoke about this before. I mean, when I was talking about kind of the editing things. I mean, I'll talk about what I did in terms of when Sina sent me the documents. I kind of went through the text, as I said before, and on Safari and on Hebrew Books. And then I tried to follow all of the references that he gave, and it really forced me. Italian is not really a language that I do. So other languages he quotes maybe, but Italian is not something really I do. That really forced me to up my game a little bit. Followed a lot of these things, using various different documentations of ancient ancient old journals from 150, 200, 300, years ago that he's quoting, and then he cites, a museum. and the catalog in a museum, and it's occurred to me, wow, he must have like gone, highly likely, may well have gone to this museum and seen their catalog, and that's where he's citing this from. And it just gave me such a fascinating insight to what his library must have looked like, checking all these references against everything, and really the mind of someone who's able to make these connections across so many different diverse areas, who perhaps once read a journal and recalls why that's relevant in 15 different places. His clear, grasp of classics, it was such a joy to read, when he's citing, Plato, Macrobius, the Saturnalia books, and, he's citing Dante. He's so proud of Dante as an Italian. And he calls him I can't remember what it is. He has a comment where he speaks about angels, and he just cites Dante. He's like the beautiful crown of Italian poetry, or so words to that effect. He's so proud of him. Again, it's just such a roller coaster. I feel like that word is very much overused, but I think it's actually for once accurate to describe this really as a roller coaster of events running backwards and forwards between different sources, Torah sources, quote unquote secular sources, because of course he didn't view them as secular sources. He viewed them as imbued with the truth that came from a Kabbalistic spark, but a truth nonetheless.
Exactly. I think that's the point that's really important to drive home with this, is that for Benamozegh, it wasn't like he was reading secular book. He didn't consider that, because he saw the interconnectedness of reality. For him, there was no book not to read. There was no realm not to uncover. And you see that as you go through these pages. Both of you,
Sina, we can start with you. What are you trying to accomplish with this Vayiqra in context, this Rabbi Benamozegh Mikra adaptation?
There's that Talmudic principle, Dibra Torah ki lashon bnei Adam, that the Torah speaks in the language of man. And for me, if you want to understand the Torah, you need to know the language of humanity. And the language of humanity is expressed in all these different realms of knowledge that Chacham Benamozegh uncovers for us and presents to us to be able to understand the Pesukim. So, in essence, I'm trying to aid others like it aided myself in their discovery of the Torah in the language of humanity. Because when we're seeing these Pesukim appear strange, as Harambam refers to them in Moreh Nebuchim, or these mitzvot, or these different areas of the Torah, these aspects of the Torah, once you understand that language, that lashon of Ben Adam, suddenly it all becomes clear, and it contextualizes the Torah, and it makes it even more real than we know viscerally it is. It just brings it to us, brings it to a level where we see it in a much clearer and contextualized way, and it's not anymore a kind of book that we hang our cloak of reality at the door before we're engaging with. No. We will use the best knowledge that exists around the world to understand this sacred text that has been with us since inception. And I think that's what I'm trying to accomplish. It did it for me, and I hope it will do it for others. Ben, what would you say is your accomplishment?
For me, I really want people to see the way in which what are commonly viewed, as I said before, as secular studies can be incorporated into the study of Torah. I mentioned this in this, I wrote a very short preface in the book, but it's not a tacit acceptance that, I suppose there are secular studies, and I suppose we can use them to understand certain things in the Torah, okay, if we have to, but really just the whole religious direction of Benamozegh is one in which he sees all these things as ideal. And I want people to get a sense of that, of the so to speak, lechatachila, as opposed to kind of b'di'avad, looking at these kinds of things, or b'di'avad, as they say in the yeshiva shesprach. But, it's not a b'di'avad situation to just use, other chokhmot, other sources of wisdom besides the Torah, but rather it's ideal. And if you look at Benamozegh's approach, you really get a sense of that. So that's why I really want people to gain from this book. It's definitely made an impact on me, but that's what I hope people get from this.
Thank you both for joining me. I will link to the book in the show's notes. Anyone interested can purchase it. And looking forward, I guess we'll see if more volumes of this come out, but for now there only is Vayiqra. That's all that's available. And so anyone interested can purchase it. Like I said, the full Hebrew edition, which comes with Shemais and Vayiqra, is available from Rabbi Zeni. That's hard to get in America. So thank you, Sina. Thank you, Ben, for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.